Hey there, everybody. I am here to talk about one of my favorite techniques, one that I'm sure a lot of players have used, but I've kind of coined this term for it over the last couple years, and I'd like to kind of give it a name, right? One of my favorite things about trading card games is that they have their own language. People say bolt the bird, and you know what they're talking about, despite all the different contexts that you can use it in. We use lots of different phrases from Magic the Gathering for all card games. Looting is one that we use a lot. Tapping is something that we use for anything turning sideways, regardless of what game it's in. And so I'm presenting you with technique number 27, the Yomi pass. So, first of all, what does Yomi mean? That's something I'm sure a lot of people are going to be asking as soon as they hear this. They might have heard this before. There's a game called Yomi Hustle. There's a card game called Yomi, which is very much related to this, this phrase and this meaning. So it comes from the Japanese word for reading or read. And in a competitive context, the competitive concept is surrounding predictions of the opponent's actions and motives. So already you can kind of get an idea for what we're going to be doing here. We need to be making predictions, reading our opponent's moves, and trying to understand what they're trying to do before we can enact the Yomi pass. So I don't know if Sun Tzu ever actually said this quote. I'm sure it's been translated many different ways, but this is it fits, the image fits the video, so I'm keeping it. But know thyself, know thy enemy. 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories. It is just as important to understand your opponent as it is to understand yourself, right? So a lot of times our personal growth comes from understanding ourselves and the things we can change. But if we want to truly defeat our opponent in every aspect, every element, we have to understand our opponent and what they're going through and what their motivations are. So, what is the Yomi pass? It's having a passive turn immediately after the rival does not have an impressive turn. So those are kind of generic terminologies for what we're going to be doing. But the gist of it is recognizing when our opponent could have taken advantage of an opportunity and realizing why they didn't. Now, it's called the Yomi pass because we're going to be essentially passing our turn. Now, universes, you have to play at least one card from your hand per turn. So you can't just straight draw and pass. That's not something that's actually available in our game. So the Yomi pass is typically playing one or two foundations and then passing and making sure that we still have a good foundational base. But it can also include building out over the rival. So let's get into the key essentials of the Yomi pass. Our turn has to involve us taking no risk, right? We've identified that our rival did not have a good turn. They did not pressure us necessarily, or they did not capitalize on vulnerabilities that we had. So we need to respond by taking no risk. If we take any risk, if we're committing a lot of foundations here, we're not passing the turn, right? We're putting ourselves in a worse position. So we need to minimize the rival interaction. Whenever we play an attack, the rival gets to enter the enhanced step, and we don't want our opponent doing anything. They didn't do anything on their turn, or they didn't do enough on their turn. We want to extend the time in the game where they continue to do nothing. And it allows you to out-sculpt the rival. So this is kind of more the specifics. A lot of times when we're enacting the Yomi pass, we're playing all the cards in our hand except for the attacks that we want to sculpt, plus one card for review. There's a lot of different ways, and again, there's a lot of different techniques to this, right? There's a lot of different facets to this technique, but one of the major things about this is even if you're not immediately seizing victory on the next turn, we do get to a point where we can out-sculpt our rival. So the most common scenario to utilize the Yomi pass, at least, where I identify it, is late in the game. The boards are well established. Both players have enough foundations. They have foundations that they like. You specifically are vulnerable. You were vulnerable on your rival's turn. You are vulnerable at a key moment in the game, and the rival does not, or they weakly attempt to take advantage of this vulnerability. So the most common example, you're completely committed out, you have no cards in hand, your rival has plenty of foundations, they still have 4 cards in hand, and then they begin to build out. They begin to play 1 or 2 foundations. That is the most common scenario that we see when when a game might turn completely around. We see it all the time on stream games and tournaments. But most importantly, our rival has to be holding more than half their hand size, right? And especially when they have a lot of resources ready, almost all their foundations ready. They could have easily played more cards, and they chose not to. This is very important. This is not the same as my opponent checking poorly, right? And they're committed out. So our opponent has to not be vulnerable as well. And what this does for us when we choose to have a passive turn in this circumstance is it lets us aggressively sculpt for a premium hand. It lets us hold the cards specifically that we want and review one, or maybe we end up blocking with one, but we review the one card that we don't want. It lets us build around deadlock foundation counts. These are typically the moments in the game where you can safely build up to 10 foundations or go from 10 foundations into 14 or 15. And those are going to be your more aggressive Yomi passes. Those are going to be the times where the Yomi pass is going to allow you to go down to a lower hand size because we have a good foundational base in our stage to protect us. And it can force the rival to fight through your full defense. So there's a lot of characters and a lot of decks right now where breaking down their board from 100 to 0 is incredibly difficult. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons we've seen these giant 8 difficulty attacks, is that a fully stacked board, even just if you guys were watching my stream earlier, even just having like 13 foundations in play can be very difficult to attack a Smiling Titan, right? They have no real defensive abilities, maybe one invincible Iron Body, but they can still block, right? Which is the sheer force of your stage. So forcing them to fight through your full defense is, I think, an underrated play or an underrated board state to get into. What this does to our rival, and this is where I think the Yomi pass is really effective, or where I really realize that it's a big deal, is it prevents them from getting cards out of their hand via blocking. So this is the whole, I think in a nutshell, the Yomi pass as a concept is my rival plays 2 attacks, right? They could have killed me if they had more attacks, but they choose to pass their turn, and because they're afraid of my offense, of my backswing, they're going to hold 4 cards out of their 6 hand size. They're going to hold 4 or 5 cards out of their 7 hand size. What do I know about those cards? They are not attacks that kill me. They're not attacks that draw cards that lets my opponent extend their turn, right? And it's not going to be cards that give my opponent some other advantage that they would risk playing. So the last thing I want to do is give my opponent the ability to get those cards out of their hand. So if they even fail a block, even if they can't physically block the attacks, if I can't win with the hand I have, then giving my opponent the opportunity to fail blocks to get cards out of their hand counts as an extra review step, right? So we want to lock them out of using enhances and responses that improve their hand or impede our board. Because don't forget, there's cards like League Invitation out there. There's cards like Showdown out there. There's cards that commit our stage, flip our stage. Blocking with Dragon Strike is really good right now. There's a lot of really nasty board interactions that you're going to want to dodge, and giving our rival the opportunity to do those when they've proven to us that their hand is not spectacular is generally the wrong call. And maybe the hardest thing to control, I'm kind of in the way here, but it can trick them into thinking our hand is also empty of threats. So when you have a passive turn back to your opponent and you hold 4 out of your 6 cards, but 3 of them are attacks, the rival's going to look at their hand and they're going to go, well, I hold 4 out of 6 cards and none of these are attacks, and they're going to assume that you had not a spectacular hand back, and that can trick them into trying to Yomi pass back to you, right? That can trick them into thinking that, your hand isn't full of good block modifiers. It's not full of specific threats and things like that. So it can really throw the opponent off when you're not taking the opportunity to fight back into the game, but instead taking opportunity to wrest control of the resource game. So the risks involved with the Yomi pass are that decks with lots of card draw only need one attack to get rolling a lot of the time. I don't think this technique is going to be very useful against decks like Pony, for example. They just need to draw into one attack to at least have a chance to get the ball rolling and keep things going. So decks that filter like Bertolt, depending on what's in their stage, there's quite a bit of form card draw cards. So there's ways that risky encounters decks, you're not going to be able to do this a lot into. So decks that only need decks that have lots of card draw only need one attack to get going. Not going to be ones where you can utilize this effectively. Trying to aggressively sculpt can result in you being forced to block with attacks. I've done this quite a few times where I end up with a 6-hander and I've got 3 really good defensive foundations and I've got 3 decent attacks, but they need synergy pieces, right? You maybe have a combo attack, you've got explosive rebuke, you've got the one single attack by itself that needs momentum. You don't have momentum yet. So we're not exactly trying to waste these attacks. But if we go down to, 3 or 4 cards in hand, they're all attacks, and our opponent does draw more attacks, you're going to be forced to block with them, and then we're kind of back to square one. And then if you're behind, this is not the way to catch up usually. Usually if your opponent has 3 or 4 more resources than you, and they've been exploiting your vulnerabilities, and maybe they don't manage to kill you, but they've got a nice big resource advantage, you building 3 or 4 back into them is probably not going to help you out. So you probably are going to have to play the block zone lottery and try to figure out a way to get damage in, to get momentum in, rather than just trying to play catch up with the build, right? And Jam does stuff. Thank you very much for the follow. I appreciate that. So if you're behind, the Yomi pass isn't really going to be a priority for you. That's going to be your opportunity to maybe try to get some damage in anyways, and maybe your opponent doesn't want to overcommit, right, to a poke. So when it works, the rival will build back into us, typically holding the same cards. I missed a word there. Oops. So when our opponent has 4 non-attacks, right, they're going to get to review 1, draw 3 cards. Maybe they draw 1 attack, right? Maybe they only draw 1 attack in those 3 cards, and they have 1 out of 6 cards are attacks. They probably won't attack back into us, or if they do, they'll attack once just to see what blocks we have, and then build 1 or 2 more cards, and they'll end up holding relatively the same hand they did before, which effectively feels like we skipped a whole turn on them. The rival will attack into our full power defense with a lackluster hand. So these are for the characters that draw 2 or 3 attacks, right? They draw all attacks, but it's still, at most, only half of their hand can be new cards. So unless they had attacks previously that for some reason they didn't play, because again, a big part of this is recognizing the opponent's motivation. Recognizing why wouldn't they have played that attack, right? If it's not a lethal attack in the first place, then it falls into the lackluster hand element. So a lot of times people will still just see orange and they'll play orange, and especially if they're trying to desperately draw some cards. Again, as you might have seen earlier on the stream, I drew a lot of cards as Bertolt, and I think we had 9 in hand at one point, and we had 1 attack. So luckily that attack had EX and powerful, so we still won the game. But I digress. The rival attacking into our full power defense with a medium hand is something you want in most scenarios. We will review the only remaining undesirable card in our hand, right? So as a 7-hander, you can go down to 3 attacks plus 1 card, 4 attacks plus 1 card, and then when you review, you should have only attacks in your hand. After you discard, then you draw back up to your hand size. We will have the resource advantage. Again, if you're behind, this isn't the play you want to make most of the time. If you're really behind on resources, again, just bringing parity is not really passing back into them with intentionality. Sometimes it is the play you have to make. Sometimes it's still your best play. Sometimes you don't have an attack, but then you're not really doing it with intentionality, right? So this is the kind of play that you make where you want to have the resource advantage, at the very least at the end of your turn. Maybe you build above them, then they build 2 and they go back above you, but it should be close and you should be ahead from the turn counts. We get to win the mental game. Our opponent failed to kill us. They failed to exploit our vulnerabilities. And now we have not given them the ability to refresh the cards in their hand to get a new hand. So they're not going to be feeling very confident about their deck. They're not going to feel very good about their hands anymore. And so you start to win the mental game at this point. And then lastly, with a good defensive deck, this can be continued until our hand is near perfect or the rival is forced to take a risk first. I see a lot of games where players have their best defensive card in hand, but they also have like 3 attacks. And there's a chance that if all these attacks go unblocked, or if most of them go unblocked, and our rival checks poorly, we can maybe get there. But then they commit all their resources. They try to play Cape of No Return on a 6. They check a 3 on Airy, and they commit 2 more cards, and they end up putting themselves in like a really medium position or a really bad position, even though they had the right cards in hand to just fortify their defense. So you do have to usually have a defensive character for this, have a more defensive oriented deck to be able to do this. But once you lock your opponent, like they held 4 cards because they were afraid of your backswing before. What's going to stop them from holding 4 cards for your backswing going forward, right? They're still going to want to hold this many cards, which means they're still only going to get the 1 review and whatever cards they play. So you're waiting for them to take a risk, whether that risk is playing lots of attacks and committing resources, or playing lots of cards from their hand to try to catch up to your build, avoid certain deadlock numbers. This works really well when you get to 10 foundations first because of this, and then can enter into deadlock at a relatively safe number, right? And then the rival gets to 10, and then they're afraid of your deadlock, because your deadlock will absolutely smoke them at this point. So if they get stuck at 10 and you get to build freely, you get to really extend the advantage you got from just taking 1 turn off. And I've seen it flip games completely 180. It's very similar to a draw 1 per turn game where you turn the corner as the defensive control deck. So when not to use this, when not to use the Yomi pass, you can force the rival to block or discard every card in their hand. Making your rival go down to 0 and drawing a fully blank hand is sometimes better for them than reviewing 1 and drawing half their hand. But if you can force them to block with every single card in their hand, you probably have a pretty good hand to begin with, one that you don't necessarily want to waste passively. And again, you get to find out. You get more knowledge from this. You get to know if they're holding attacks or not, or why wouldn't they have played that attack? You get to force them to discard all the actions in their hand. Again, this one is pretty tumultuous because you might run into those showdowns, those barrier shields, airy smiles type of thing to like disrupt you. You might check poorly while doing this. So, but if you can make your opponent go to 0 cards in hand, that's usually a pretty good gamble on your end too. Your foundations are the best blocks for this situation. This is one of the hardest ones. I've been in some situations where I would love to play 1 card pass into my opponent, right? But I have 2 foundations in my hand, and I have 4, 3 damage moves. I've got Absorbed Energy, Spirit Strike. I've got Dimensional Sphere, right? I've got attacks that aren't really attacks. They're not really an attack, but they are going to enter an enhanced step if I play it. And I really need to hold this +2 high block, or I really need to hold a syndicate target, a +0 low block, and I can't really, afford to play this foundation in my hand. Maybe my foundation is Faith Shield, right? Something like that. So it can be really tough when you don't want to enter an enhanced step for your rival at all, but you also know that you can't necessarily win the game, or it's going to be very, very difficult. Because again, part of the Yomi pass is our opponent's not vulnerable, right? Our opponent has resources, they have cards. They just chose not to play them. So when your foundations are the bright block or the best block, this is where you kind of end up having to be aggressive and playing a different game. And, luckily those blocks will save you, but it can be very, very annoying when you don't get to just build out because all the attacks in your hand are low blocks. I've been there where I'm holding Walk the Dog and pressing the advantage, and I don't want to play either one of those into a fully ready board, and all my other cards are my mids and my high blocks. So you got to be careful. The need for momentum outweighs the odds of them bricking again. This is also a big one. This is where, you're like sub 10 health and they have 30 plus health. They're full health. They're a Godzilla. They are a Smiling Titan. They are a Bear Tolt. They are a Reiner. And you have to make some progress, right? You've been getting beat down. You're behind, and you need to make some progress into this game. Your deck needs momentum to play defense effectively. You're just not going to be able to do the Yomi pass. If you need to get momentum by attacking, and you need to catch up because your deck is probably not going to do 35 damage in one turn ever. You probably need to modify your deck a bit, right? If you can't ever put together that big of a string, we probably have an issue elsewhere. But some decks aren't as good at doing it. So make sure that you're identifying times where you need to do a poke. You need to kind of test the waters a bit and get a resource for later. The opponent's deck relies on high difficulty threats. So one of the bad reads you can make is my opponent having 5 ready resources, and you think that they don't have attacks, but the attack in their hand is actually Colossus Titan attacks that they'd have to play on an 11 or 12. A lot of times those decks aren't necessarily going to commit out just to deal another 8 damage or so. They win more by having the tempo and not taking damage and not strictly racing you. Like Smiling Titan, I don't think wants to strictly race you. It wants to poke you heavily every turn and then maintain a level of defense that doesn't let you catch up, right? That's not strictly a race. It's not literally saying I'm going to out damage you. It's saying I'm going to damage you efficiently. It's an efficient style of Smiling Titan where the damage is efficient enough to allow them to fend you off. So the opponent's deck relying on high difficulty threats means that they probably do have another attack in their hand, and they're just they're just content to play only one. And then the last one is you have Genkai's Guidance in hand. If you have Genkai's Guidance in hand, you probably do a lot better by baiting the opponent into going aggressive on their next turn. This is a get out of jail free kind of a hand trap, so sometimes you'll still probably want to do it depending on where we're at in the game. If you're really, really defenseless elsewhere, maybe don't. Maybe don't be aggressive with the Genkai's in hand. But Genkai's is definitely one of the best get out of jail free cards of all time. And that one is going to encourage you to be aggressive. You want to have committed foundations to destroy for its effect, right? So don't be afraid to be a little more aggressive with Genkai's in your hand. So cards are helpful to the Yomi pass. Cards that help this strategy are Disarming Glance. Disarming Glance can not only allow you to poke without letting your rival kind of sculpt and fix their hand with their card draw effects and things like that. It can prevent the opponent on the next turn. So we talked about decks that only need one attack to draw a million cards and get the ball rolling. If you get to Disarming Glance their first attack, especially if you have a Cape of No Return or a way to abort that attack, right, and lock it off for the whole turn, then playing passively can help you out a lot. It can effectively force your opponent to waste an attack just to force you to flip Disarming Glance, and then they'll build 1, maybe 2 foundations, and we're right back where we were. The Yomi pass was successful, despite them playing a Electric Moth or something like that. Another one is Beautiful Suzuki. So there's a lot of form, discard and draw cards, form, draw card. Almost all of them fit into this theme. So Beautiful Suzuki is a stand-in for every card that draws a card outside of the enhanced step, and this is something that you can do from the deck building stage is go, well, if I don't want my deck to be a blazing speed aggro deck, if I want my deck to be able to take a turn off and still get ahead of my opponent, you need cards that draw at form speed, and I'm glad that there's quite a few options out there. And then lastly, we have Wild Wild Pussycats. This is in the same vein, but this is a selective card. And so you'll see characters that have used this card a lot, because they can flip it, destroy it, rebuild it. Flip it, destroy it, rebuild it. Flip it, play it from face down as overhaul. Flip it, add it to our hand. And this is one of the better ones to, cycle through and find that defensive foundation that makes it okay for us to pass into our rival and give them another opportunity. Because it is risky. It is quite risky to just, not force the opponent to think at all in our turn. We have a couple more cards here. Crisis of Confidence. Our opponent probably committed a foundation or two to go back, to attack us on their turn. And one of the things I see the most is people go, well, I don't have a great hand, but they have like 4 out of 9 foundations committed. I don't want them to ready everything, and I don't want to have to crack their full board again. A card like Crisis of Confidence says I can freeze the important ones. If you've only got 2 frozen, they've got enough that 8 or more that you can freeze both of them. Then it's not like you took a whole turn off, right? We get to assume that same scenario. So this one's a big one. It's a little costly. I don't know how many decks really want this card most of the time, but if you are trying to play a slower paced deck, Crisis of Confidence can lock things down for multiple turns, and it allows you to play a little more passively, and they'll still be committed on your next turn. In a similar vein, we have Final Words. Final Words is great when you want to build out a bit and then just destroy a rival foundation. Again, you're thinking to yourself, ah, man, they committed this card that I really want to take advantage of. Don't want them to ready it. That's cool. Just destroy it. So Chomp fits here. There's 1 or 2 other form abilities I think that will commit or flip something. A lot of them are deadlock, of course, but Final Words and things like that fit here. And then we have Psychic Spirit Glass. So this is a good one for when you have like that medium hand where you have like, maybe I can get in there, and then you Psychic Spirit Glass and you look at their hand and it's like you're playing against Ryukyu and they're all blank +1 blocks or something, or they have a block for every zone, and you're not going to win, but now you know that they have no attacks, right? You have confirmed for sure 100% that me attacking you says you get to review an extra card. So you don't want to waste a Spirit Glass like this 90% of the time, but if your deck is already utilizing a Spirit Glass, don't feel obligated to attack after it. Recognize that them being stuck with 4 non-attacks in their hand is going to allow you to build and be a little passive and have a little bit of that cushion. And then we've got Airy. This is another really obvious one I talked about before. I've seen a lot of people feel pressured to attack, feel pressured to take advantage of their rival, having had a lackluster turn, and they feel like they've bought themselves an extra turn. They didn't earn, so they want to be aggressive with it. When in reality, you're better off just building the Airy, build the Cape of No Return, right? Broken Psyche, whatever it is, whatever your defensive foundation is, just defensive cards in general, but specifically ones that are not speed reduction, right? Ones that I guess what I should say is these are cards that don't require our card advantage, right? They don't require cards from our hand, because again, we're trying to sculpt. So defense from your stage, where we don't have to worry about an attack at all, and we don't have to use cards from our hand, are definitely going to help when you want to have that passive turn. Next up, we have Showdown. We talked about this one before. This is one where you can kind of sit on it for a while, and any turn that you would have had is probably better after a Showdown. Any turn that you would have into your rival's ready board is almost certainly going to be better than if they lose their 2 best foundations to being committed. So if you have a Showdown, maybe you want to just be a little more passive, bait them into attacking, force them into attacking you by taking that resource advantage. And then Short Work. So this is for the glacially slow decks. Short Work, not only is it going to extend your hand, sacrificing a foundation means we're almost certainly going to sacrifice a blank or a face down. This goes back to modifying your deadlock values, right? This is going to let us build another face up without going into deadlock. It's going to show our opponent that we have an attack. If we have 4 cards in hand, they know 1 is an attack. They know it's a mid block. That's going to be information that they go into their next turn going, okay, well, now if they draw any more attacks, that attack count is sort of guaranteed. Also, you can review it and just do it again, right? So Short Work for the glacially slow decks, being able to basically take advantage of your opponent at any time. Same thing with Risky, right? When you've got offense that you can conjure at any time. Elder Toguro, perfect example. All of these discard pile playing form abilities. You are able to pass effectively knowing that you can punish the opponent at any time. So the most important thing is having a defense that fatigues them and forces them to put themselves in a vulnerable position. So Short work is a pretty niche option, but it fits the idea. So, have you ever used this technique? Have you ever used the Yomi pass before, and maybe you just didn't realize that now there's a name for it? I don't think this is like a term anyone other than myself has used. I've used it with a couple of friends before, and so I think some of the unfun stuff guys might know it. But let me know in the comments if this is something where you said, hey, my opponent could have easily killed me, but they didn't. So clearly, those cards must not be attacks. The last thing I want them to do is draw more attacks and fix their hands. So I'm going to lay off the gas. We're going to build our best foundations. And next turn, we're going to have all this gas plus whatever we draw. And hopefully we can close the game out from there. Let me know down in the comments below what you guys think of the Yomi pass and if you want to see more videos like this.